The revelation this week by celebrated author Thomas King that he is not Cherokee has left some people shocked and upset. The admission by the 82-year-old is also not coming as a big surprise for others. For more on this news, our Truth in Politics panel is here for another round. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Niigaan and Jennifer, thanks so much for being here. Jennifer, we'll start with you. What were your thoughts when you heard that author Thomas King is in fact not Cherokee or Indigenous at all?
I feel like I wasn't really that surprised, I guess in a sense, because there were already those rumors, and I feel a little weird that maybe those rumors aren't as widely known, but for me it felt like, didn't we already know this? Like, this has been widely talked about, I guess, in some of our academic circles, because Thomas King was somebody that, when I was going through the SUNTEP program through the University of Saskatchewan, which is a Métis-based Bachelor of Education program, we had to read Thomas King. And so I remember there already being conversations about that, and back then maybe it was more of a conspiracy rather than a fact. But now that it's kind of coming out, it's more widely known, and I think the impact is being felt collectively now, rather than maybe some of the smaller conversations that were happening in pools of people. So I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I am feeling the same amount of backlash and conversation that everybody else is feeling right now, because it's being talked about everywhere. Facebook, every app I open, it's being talked about in our circles. And I think also the harm that's being caused from this, where, Indigenous people, even writers that maybe saw themselves in pieces of Thomas King, now it's almost like, who do we actually have? And are there going to be more people? We heard about this with Buffy St. Marie, and it seems like more and more people that were the trailblazers or people that kind of, paved some of the way in different spaces are now being outed as not Indigenous at all.
Yeah, when you were talking about, books in university, Inconvenient Indian was all over university. Just about every Indigenous studies class had a reading about Inconvenient Indian. Niigaan, you wrote a column on this calling it a gut punch. Why does it hit you so hard?
25 books, 3 anthologies, multiple film, radio, TV appearances. Tom King casts an enormous shadow. And of course, Jen's right. We are left at the end going, okay, well, since we've spent so much time, both Indigenous peoples, but predominantly non-Indigenous peoples, I've actually never had Tom King on any of my syllabi, but we have talked about him when I was a graduate student, when I was an undergraduate student, classes that I took, and then also the fact that he takes up this immense footprint in the literary landscape throughout the country. It almost feels like his shadow is cast on almost every single other Indigenous writer, like legitimate Indigenous author who has looked up, understood, researched. Even in our most complex of identities, all of us take the time to find out where we come from. Even those who are removed in the child welfare system. The big question that people want to know is, where do I come from? Like, what can I know about that family, that community, that clan? And the fact that others had to do this work was tremendously harmful, which is where that gut punch begins to enter into. Because while there was, of course, rumors for years, there was also a lot of trust put in this man, and that this individual said that he had done the research, or at least knew enough to keep representing himself in particular ways over and over and over again, impacting all of us. We trusted that in lots of different ways. And finally, it took a group of people who are very committed. And clearly, it wasn't as hard as perhaps he might have laid it out to be able to find out who he was. It's a gut punch because it's not only the amount of resources that it's been taken to expose this truth, but also now for us all to revisit all of the past 15, 20, 25, 30 years, going back to 1990 and the novel Medicine River, the impact that he's had on all of our lives.
Despite rumors for many years, King says he really did believe he was Cherokee. Do you believe that, Jen?
Do I believe he thought he was? I think there were probably components of him in the initial days that thought maybe he was in some way, especially when you hear the word Cherokee, and I think it's because Cherokee people have been referenced in so much mainstream media and even like film and things like that in the United States. So it started becoming a very common theme where even people in Canada that really have no ties to Cherokee people would claim that they were part Cherokee. I mean, we heard about it allegedly from the Premier of Alberta as well, and there potentially being some type of Indigenous ancestry there. So I think there was maybe a part of him that thought, okay, maybe somewhere along the line I'm part Cherokee. But I think that with the amount of resources he probably would have had, I would like to think that he didn't find out and then kept going. But it's really hard to say because someone of that magnitude would have those resources. And you think when you're that skilled of a writer, you would have been doing some type of research and some type of checks and balances on who it is that you're claiming to be. And especially at his age now, I'm finding it just odd that this is all what he's deciding to address now.
Niigaan, 30 seconds. You relayed in your column that this makes it harder for you to trust again. What are the repercussions here?
Yeah, you trust. I mean, it's almost everything's on the table for very legitimate people who are grounded in community and nation, because we are constantly. It's not that we don't ask the question; it's that we now have taken many people on their word and consistently, time and time again. The Canadian publishing landscape, which is really what the question is here. Why is it that Canada keeps giving so much attention to particular authors that have dubious connections and in their books talk a lot, obsess about it almost, about their own identity, whereas the rest of us are speaking about nationhood, stolen land, the impacts of residential schools. Like, we are talking about the issues that are in our communities, but don't seem to be catching the national imagination. And that's really, I think, what the big question is here is how do we move forward after this big, huge gap that's going to be led within Indigenous literature in the Canadian literary landscape. And my hope is that we pay attention to authors who have been there the entire time and the many new voices that are dedicated to grassroots and community and working with people, real life Indigenous peoples that know who they are, where they're coming from, and have done the work necessary so that when they represent themselves, they don't harm.
We'll have to leave it there, but we're going to continue this conversation over on the podcast. Jennifer, the Prime Minister is meeting with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith on Thursday to sign a memorandum of understanding that is expected to greenlight a pipeline to the West Coast. Your thoughts on this?
I'm concerned, especially because I've already kind of aired my grievances about Bill C5, and I want to be clear that I've always maintained the fact that I'm not anti-resource development. I'm not. But at the same time, it seems as though the federal government likes to pick and choose who gets to decide when a project goes ahead. And, the Premier of Alberta still has a lot of ongoing issues with nations, more specifically in Alberta. We saw that the Chief Sheldon Sunshine had come out with that cease and desist from Sturgeon Lake First Nation. There are a lot of issues. And I know that Bill C5 opened that Pandora's box wide open again. And I know there are a lot of nations that still feel they're not consulted. We have this new Prime Minister's Advisory Council. No one I know or any nations I'm aligned with have any idea kind of what's even going on with that. And it concerns me because, it might happen in Saskatchewan too. And I think we're going to see more and more of this because the Prime Minister is very motivated to get resource projects underway. It's just from what I'm hearing in Saskatchewan on the ground is that a lot of chiefs are not being consulted or talked to. And that means that their communities are not being talked to and consulted either.
Niigaan, this has been news all week, and we're hearing plenty of opposition in British Columbia. The Premier and several First Nations say it is never going to happen. Do you think such a project could overcome the opposition?
Well, I don't know how. The Premier of BC has said, I'm not even getting a phone call about this particular memorandum, and the Grand Chief of the Union of BC Chiefs, Stuart Phillip, is saying this is not happening in any way, shape, or form. I just don't know how you overcome that. Like, do you just pick and choose particular First Nations like they did way back in the day? Back in the days of the early Indian Act, if they didn't like the way one democratically elected leader was representing their community, they would just say, well, fine, we're just going to pick somebody else, a unilateral person on the street here to sign off on this particular, change or bill or whatever the law was. That's harking back to some pretty dark times between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. My hope is that cooler heads will prevail. I'm going to throw something else out there that possibly this is all about. The Mark Carney's under a tremendous amount of pressure. from particularly the Alberta Premier to get resource development going. And for a long time, going back to the days of Justin Trudeau, the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith constantly throwing rocks at the federal government and saying, "Oh, they're anti-Alberta, they're anti-energy, they put on a tanker ban to stop us." Well, Mark Carney, through this memorandum, has thrown the ball right back into Danielle Smith's court and saying, "Well, you deal with it then. You try to get this work done. You try to get your provincial premier, next door neighbor on board, or BC First Nations." And also, never mind the fact that, if you had tankers going up and down the BC coast, it is so dangerous. It is on top of the issue of any environmental spill, oil spill, would devastate the landscape permanently. I don't have any idea how you just ignore science or the environment or the fact that tides come in and out of those areas in BC. I mean, if the Alberta Premier wants to somehow magically try to get all of these things aligned, then I think what Mark Carney did is put this back in her court.
Jennifer, is it possible this memorandum is just a way to appease Alberta for a while?
Part of it, I think so. I think that, Prime Minister Mark Carney definitely has an interest in resource development. So I don't think he's just trying to make Alberta happy in the sense that he wants those national interests to go forward. Bill C-5 kind of gave those ministers the power to bring projects forward if they deem it in the national interest. So we know that this new Liberal government, and I call it new because it's under new leadership, is very motivated to get projects going. So I think there's a part of it where he wants to see this, and then another part where there's fractured relationships in the West that do need to be fixed. And I will say that from what I've heard, even from elected officials, in Saskatchewan, can't speak for Alberta, is that this government does seem a little bit more enticed to actually communicate with Saskatchewan. And I'm guessing it's probably very similar to Alberta, where the relationship isn't perfect. It never will be when it comes to the West with Ottawa. But I will say that Carney does appear to want his team to work a little bit better with the West and with our Western provinces. So maybe a step in the right direction there. But ramming through a pipeline is probably not the way to do it.
Finally, Niigaan, is this more about politics than an actual project happening?
Well, I think that Jen's on to something really important there. There are lots of glass half full ways to see the actions of Carney, of dealing with some very long historical grievances in the West, and to try to, move certain projects. I mean, just think about the Port of Churchill in Manitoba. No one ever talked about Manitoba as being a area bastion resource development area for Canada. I mean, we talked about that lot here in the province, but it wasn't sort of on the national agenda, and then anything other than really silica sand. And now we're talking about the Hudson Bay port of Churchill being this potentially big resource outline to the world. And so I think that Carney's trying to work in lots of different ways, and I think that politics is the number one way that the game is, and the projects of the national interest. If you think about it in terms of are they really going to get all of these projects done, or are they casting a wide net and seeing where it is that certain projects have certain pickup? One of the big problems that they have with many pipeline projects is they don't have a proponent. And if Alberta is the proponent for this latest memorandum, then that means they have to do all the heavy lifting, all the work. And I think that what Carney's doing is playing some political games here to be able to say, okay, well, if you're that interested, we're going to take a lot of pressure off the centralized government. We're going to put them onto regional areas, and then you have to deal with this, and then you have to get some work done. His famous phrase, of course, is we're not 13 economies, we're one economy. And I think that particularly what he's trying to do is bring more people onto that side. So on one level, good. On another level, I think when it comes to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, as we've just talked about just a minute ago, there is some very serious problems with the way in which First Nations, Inuit, and Métis governments are being positioned as not being included or being strategically included, picking and choosing your friends, which always leads to conflict and division. And I don't see a path forward that isn't without a great deal of conflict, particularly when you come to these projects of the national interest.
Yeah, I hear you there. Niigaan and Jennifer, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah,
Thank you.